Every day, something dramatic happens in the Caribbean that affects our lives. We'll give you the details. We'll give you the facts on Caribbean Perspective with Eddie Frederick. Host Eddie Frederick.
So glad you can join us. The IMF says COVID-19 hit Caribbean similar to cardiac arrest. This story takes the lead in our 971st edition of Caribbean Perspective for Monday 26 October 2020, as Grenada marks 37 years since the U.S. military intervention that put an end to the turmoil that resulted from the crash of the Maurice Bishop-led revolution against Eric Gairy, where the ultra-Marxist faction of the Russian-Cuban-styled socialist regime in St. George's seized power from Maurice Bishop, turning the island into a hotbed of uncertainty. Yesterday, Sunday, was observed as Thanksgiving Day, otherwise known as the most uncelebrated Thanksgiving holiday in the world. Details of the IMF story after this important message.
The hurricane season is now upon us, so we as Caribbean people need to remember to think safety and be prepared. Avoid venturing outside during a storm or hurricane, especially if there are strong winds. Rooftops and other debris are often blown about and can cause great damage.
Welcome back. The impact of COVID-19 on the countries of the region has been likened by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to a heart attack. In an article written by the IMF economists Samuel Pienaguru, Jorge Roldas, and Alejandro Wena, titled Pandemic Persistence Clouds Latin America and the Caribbean Recovery, the authors contended, despite being relatively successful at containing the virus spread, the sudden stop in tourist arrivals and lockdowns was equivalent to a cardiac arrest to the economies. The authors argued that since the Caribbean countries are dependent on tourism for anywhere between 20 to 90% of the GDP and employment, they were the hardest hit. They admitted that COVID-19 has hit Latin America and the Caribbean harder than other parts of the world, both in human and economic terms. Pienaguru et al. Revealed that the relatively large human toll on the region is evident. With only 8.2% of the world's population, the region had 28% of the cases and 34% of the deaths by the end of September 2020. The IMF projects a real GDP contraction of 8.1% in 2020. Unlike in previous recessions, the IMF added that employment contracted more strongly than GDP in the second quarter of 2020. The authors noted that although many jobs would be recovered as activity resumes, current estimates point to lasting income losses, potentially reversing some of the social progress achieved until 2015. They added that poverty is projected to increase significantly, exacerbating income inequality, already among the highest in the world before the pandemic. The IMF writers argued, quote, "The recovery is expected to be protracted. Our forecast is for growth of 3.6% in 2021. Most countries will not go back to pre-pandemic GDP until 2023, the real economic per capita until 2025, later than any other region." Pienaguru et al. Highlighted that the outlook will be shaped by how the pandemic impacts external and domestic demand and how the scars left by the crisis affect the region's production capacity. The authors penned that the global economy's long and uncertain recovery means a dim outlook for exports. Additionally, they argued that domestically, consumption and contact-intensive goods and services will likely be depressed until the pandemic is controlled, and income levels might stay subdued even afterwards. According to the IMF, the resulting weak demand and uncertainty will hold investment back over the medium term, while some job losses might become permanent, reducing potential growth, especially where fiscal support has been timid. Bold policy actions by many governments were critical in mitigating the pandemic's economic and social impact, but Pienaguru et al. Said that these policies would leave a legacy of higher public and private debt. Amidst the weaker than expected recovery, the IMF noted that a more persistent pandemic would impose more difficult choices for governments. The authors indicated that scarring and low potential GDP growth add to the short-run policy challenges. They mentioned that some structural reforms may support confidence and the recovery, especially if they manage to lay the foundations for more sustainable and inclusive growth going forward. Are there high-ranking government officials involved in the infamous drug Susu scheme in Trinidad and Tobago? Well, according to Opposition Senator Wade Mark, the answer is yes, and he claims he has information their alleged involvement goes quite deep. But that's not all. He's making a link between DSS and the August 10th general election. Renessa Cutting of TV6 News reports.
Where, how, whom, and why $22 million could have been found by the police, enter a police station, disappear after, and nobody could tell the country what happened there.
While during the budget debate in the Senate on Friday, Opposition Senator Wade Mark proffered a possible explanation and challenged the Prime Minister to confirm or deny.
I read in the news there, and no one has denied it so far, that 3 PNM politicians...
Senator Mark, you have 5 more minutes.
3 PNM politicians are involved in this drug Susu. I would like the Prime Minister to share with this country the names of these 3 PNM politicians.
Further, Senator Mark claims to have some intel on the matter.
We understand from sources that came to us that before the general election, members of DSS were approached by these PNM politicians, according to our information, and given money so that they could buy votes from the people on election day. These are issues that are coming to us. And we want the government to tell us what role they have to play in DSS, whether DSS was a slush fund established by the PNM to bribe people for the elections.
4 police officers have since been suspended and 11 transferred as internal TTPS investigations continue. The Defence Force is also investigating any possible involvement of its members in the scheme. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has moved to enlist the assistance of foreign investigators.
Because of what it means, pointing to and fingering unacceptable levels of corruption in the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service.
But the opposition sees this movement to ensure transparency as one intended to deceive.
I have a concern when the Prime Minister now agrees, before he didn't agree, now agrees to send the Commissioner of Police somewhere, and then he takes over the investigation.
The Commissioner is in fact on vacation leave until November 1st. Meanwhile, the drugs Susu operations seem unaffected, with another branch recently setting up shop in Tobago. Renessa Cutting, TV6 News.
You're listening to Caribbean Perspective with Eddie Frederick.
The Director of Public Prosecutions in Guyana has withdrawn the private criminal charges against Clement Mingo, Keith Lowenfield, and Valder Lawrence. Here are the details from Travis Chase of HGP Nightly News.
When Chief Elections Officer Keith Lowenfield made another court appearance in the Georgetown Magistrates Court on Friday morning, the prosecution informed the magistrate that the 3 private criminal charges filed against the senior GCOM functionary in relation to alleged electoral fraud have been withdrawn, but the charges which the police instituted will remain in court.
The trial for those matters is scheduled to begin on Monday, and they come today with Friday, and they withdrew those charges. So they clearly, as we had said at the start of that trial, were not in a position to commence them. They clearly realized that they were not in a position to commence them. And the Director of Public Prosecutions, after our invitation several months ago to review them and withdraw the charges, has waited until the matter is about to start to withdraw the charges. So I don't need to comment on that. That speaks for itself.
Lowenfield's attorney, Nigel Hughes. The 3 private criminal charges were filed against Lowenfield by the New Movement candidate Daniel Kanai and People's Progressive Party civic candidate Desmond Morayon. In the case against the police versus Lawrence, Mingo, Lowenfield, and others, Mr. Hughes said he and his team object to Sanjeev Dattadin being given approval to prosecute in the cases because he's a sitting PPP Member of Parliament, and that to have Mr. Dattadin lead the prosecution has the appearance of bias.
To give him the responsibility for the prosecution of a matter which is highly political in nature, and which Mr. Hanneman agreed had political consequences, we believe is a poor exercise of her discretion. But more importantly and more fundamentally, all prosecutors have a responsibility for fairness. They have no interest in conviction. They have a responsibility for fairness. Part of that responsibility is that they must bring all the information to the court, whether it's in favor of their case or against their case. The Legal Practitioners Act, as a specific requirement, says that all prosecutors have an obligation to be dispassionate. We believe that the appointment of a sitting government MP as a prosecutor completely violates all of those and has the appearance of bias.
Nightly News was also informed Friday afternoon that the private criminal charges against Region 4 returning officer Claremont Mingo and the chairman of the People's National Congress Reform Valda Lawrence have also been withdrawn.
That if Mr. Dattadin or any prosecutor who has a political bias comes across information that is in favor of an accused person, that they will share that information. And therefore we believe Mr. Lowenfield's right to a fair trial has been adversely impaired. We've invited the court to consider this, and we certainly will be taking further steps in relation to this. The court ordered us to put over our submissions in writing, and we come back in 3 weeks.
Travis Chase, HGP Nightly News.
As the state of Guyana observes the 100th birthday anniversary of the late Executive President of Guyana, Janet Jagan, politicians of the day are being urged to follow in the footsteps of a woman dubbed as a trailblazer and an extraordinary activist. Amil Griffith of HGP Nightly News has that report.
Rising to prominence following the death of her husband, the late Janet Rosenberg Jagan served as the first female president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana from December 1997 to August 1999. Due to ill health, the American-born Guyanese renounced her presidency to Barra Jagdeo. To this date, she is the only woman to have held that position. Lauded a freedom fighter and an honorable stateswoman by President Irfan Ali and Prime Minister Brigadier Mark Phillips, the late Jagan became the first elected woman to the Georgetown City Council, the first woman to become Deputy Speaker, the first woman Prime Minister, first Vice President, and was one of the first women to enter the House of Assembly, among many other accolades. She died of a heart attack at the age of 88 in 2009. President Irfan Ali, at the launch of a commemorative centenary stamp, stated that the late Jagan was a torchbearer for freedom and democracy.
She devoted almost her entire adult life in struggling for Guyana's freedom and the restoration of democracy. Despite the daunting challenges she and her party faced during those struggles, she was never fazed or discouraged. She believed in the righteousness and justness of her cause, and its inevitable triumph. She pursued this cause to the very end.
Former President Donald Ramotar stated that politicians should emulate her will and drive because that would lead to the development and progression of the country. He explained that female politicians especially can learn from her legacy.
She never asked the Comrade to do what she herself would not have done. She lived a long life here. She held offices in government and many offices, and there's not a finger pointing at her, even in a slanderous way, to attack her integrity.
The late Jagan was, however, accused of being contemptuous of the laws of Guyana after she threw a court order over her shoulder on the day that she was sworn in. The chairman of the Chadi Jagan Research Center, Haidar Ali, defended her legacy and added that regardless of the court order incident, the late Jagan was a woman that had the best interest for her people at heart. For the HGP Nightly News, I'm Mel Griffith.
I am Eddie Frederick. This has been Caribbean Perspective, a whole new approach to highlighting developments in the Caribbean. In the meantime, please continue to log on to CaribbeanPerspective.com for more daily news and more.